right, we've got Dr. David Luke on the line now, and they're just polishing up his screen. So it's my pleasure to introduce him. Dr. David Luke is Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Greenwich, UK, Honorary Senior Lecturer at the Centre for Psychedelic Research, Imperial College, London, and Lecturer on Consciousness, Spirituality and Transpersonal Psychology for the Alef Trust and Liverpool's John Moores University. His research focuses on transpersonal experiences, anomalous phenomena, and altered states of consciousness, especially via psychedelics. He has published more than 100 academic papers in this area, including 13 books, including Otherworlds, Psychedelics and Exceptional Human Experiences he published in 2019. When he's not running clinical drug trials with LSD, he's conducting DMT field experiments or observing apparent weather control with Mexican shamans. And he also, in his spare time, directs the Ecology, Cosmos and Consciousness Salon at the Institute of Ecotechnics, London, and is co-founder and trustee of Breaking Convention, the International Conference on Psychedelic Consciousness, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And Dr. David Luke is talking today about DMT, Indigenous Gateway to the Soul, and Endogenous Reality Thermostat. And he's coming through by video right now, so please welcome him. Thank you.
Thanks so much again. Sorry for all the horrible technical hitches. And good morning, good afternoon. I'm going to jump right in somewhere further along the line, but that's good because I'm just going to presuppose everybody here knows more about DMT than I would ordinarily give them credit for, but you probably do, knowing you lot. So I think the point the point I'm going to focus on primarily with this talk, the little time I have left, is this idea that DMT is an endogenous reality thermostat, that it's made naturally occurring within the human body and therefore could explain all manner of spontaneous mystical like experiences, like near-death experience and so on and so forth. And also exploring this extraordinary notion of it being an indigenous gateway to the soul, i.e. the vine of the dead with ayahuasca, or the vine of the soul, and that it's used to communicate with spirits, because of course experiences with DMT, less so ayahuasca, but especially with DMT, are very much marked by the nature of encounters with what we might call entities, which do seem to pop up with an alarming frequency. As Terence McKenna said, you get elves, everybody does. Well, not quite everybody, as it turns out, according to some of the survey research. It's probably more in the region of about 10 to 25%. And that's also including some of our own studies with kind of totally discrete data sets rather than just self-selecting online participants. So, quite a lot of people get elves, and probably enough. Do the elves also get humans when they take DMT is a curious question. You don't necessarily always need DMT, of course, to get elves. You may get it, as I did, and some of my students, on Datura, when we were accidentally given it by some indigenous people in Brazil. And in this case, it was a kind of shared hallucination because three of us saw the same little person. That's a whole other discussion there, but it does throw up something about the nature of these entity encounters and their possible or probable ontology, whatever that might be. Some of the really interesting features of entity encounters that people get with DMT, of course, is their alarming frequency of particular types. So Elves is obviously one of them. You get these trickster, jester-like archetypes a lot as well. I could probably put some figures on that in the kind of few percentage region, but there are some even more specific kind of entity encounters that people have, which beg a kind of deeper investigation and interpretation, such as giant praying mantis, insectoid brain operators that kind of tower over you, tending to insert or remove things primarily from your brain, but also your body, often considered to be neutral in their own emotional stance, perhaps benign usually, and often also farming the individual for their own emotions at the same time. Now, I haven't got any prevalence figures for this, but I've heard dozens of accounts of people having this experience. I gave a talk about this in a pub the other day, and two of the people in the audience had this experience. So it's not that uncommon, maybe not as uncommon as we would like it to be if we had an ordinary kind of random kind of neural firing explanation for what's actually going on there. And here's some other accounts. This one from David J. Brown, his actual first DMT experience some 30 odd years ago. And yeah, you get the idea anyway. And just throw this lovely Escher picture in there as well. Maybe Escher was also on DMT or his own internal supply. So yeah, here's some prevalence statistics, which has come from a recent survey with over 2,500 people's entity encounters. The alien described as alien in many ways in up to 40% of the cases, and this perhaps DMT could also account for spontaneous alien abduction-like experiences as well. But there we see elves, fairies, gnomes popping up with quite alarming proclivity. And another recent survey, we found fairly similar statistics. There we go, clowns and jesters, about 6%. And insectoids, only like 2.5% or so, still somewhat disturbing. And these are some data from our own discrete data set of just 40 participants, but we kind of witnessed them all having high dose DMT experiences, quite a few more jesters, and a lot more insectoids. But there you go. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to just dash through some of this, but I'm trying to work out where I'm going on the slide. So, you know, we could probably have to take into account the fact that, all right, since Terence McKenna said everybody get elves, then of course everybody gets elves because they're kind of primed to do so. Whether or not they've directly heard Terence McKenna saying that quote, it's in the memosphere, right? The fact that he's actually kind of made this pronouncement means that you can never have a culturally unmediated experience, right? It's somewhere out there in our cultural sphere that the idea that you get elves if you take DMT. However, the very first accounts of DMT use from Stephen Zara from the 1950s in Hungary, and this is published in some really obscure journals, does give accounts of people encountering little people when he first injected it into himself and injected it into his psychiatric colleagues as well. So those encounter experiences, in some ways, you can see are there from the very first historical accounts before they were memes, presumably. Although, of course, we can't, with any degree of certainty, account for this lack of kind of cultural influence. And that is always going to be problematic. Yeah, I'm not going to go into those bits, but probably one of the most astonishing thing about these entity encounter experiences is that people tend to believe they are real. That, you know, by far and away is the big kind of take-home message of astonishment. And in a recent large-scale survey from the team at Johns Hopkins University, they reported that looking at people's prior metaphysical beliefs, those people who had an entity encounter on DMT, who were atheists before the experience, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards, which kind of somewhat attests to their astonishing power of these experiences. You know, that when people say DMT is a bit like being punched in the back of the head by God, which they sometimes do, I think we have to take that somewhat literally in terms of the profundity of these experiences. And we also see other changes in metaphysical beliefs, not just from DMT, but with all psychedelics, in that people tend to move in the direction of animism and panpsychism, or at least tend to increase the belief in the consciousness of other than human things, including plants, animals, fungi, and even inanimate, natural, and man-made objects. So there is a tendency to believe in the kind of greater personification of the other. I'm not going to make any claims as to the reality of that. So even in our own research as well, we did some surveys with people's encounter experiences of an ecological nature, either with kind of different creatures, whether they're mythical creatures, hybrid, half human, half something else, half animal encounters, plant or fungus intelligence, encounters with animal spirits, guides, or communications, and even transformations into other beings. And of course, some natural disaster visions as well, just for good measure. In our survey, I'm going to break this down a little bit for you. These are all those people taking on different substances, reporting these encounter experiences at least once. And we find that with ayahuasca, for instance, encounters with the apparent intelligence of ayahuasca was reported by 37% of people. And even the experiences of being transformed into another species, which is, you don't normally get that on your kind of ayahuasca retreat brochure, was reported by 25% of people. So this is an extraordinarily common experience, which kind of somewhat goes beyond the usual advertising of, oh yes, ayahuasca can be good for helping you deal with your depression or increase your KPI apps for your new software tech. Being turned into another species might be a bit of a surprise. Where am I going with this? I'm not going to go down the ecological angle. I'm going to try and get to some of the discussions and arguments around the nature of these beings. I can find my slides. Sorry, this is all a bit rushed. So that myself and some colleagues got together and tried to get to the bottom of this infernal, eternal debate about the nature or the ontology of these entities. And we assembled some of the greatest minds we could find on the planet, and had a symposium and produced a book called DMT Dialogues. We've also since followed that up with another symposium and another book called DMT Entity Encounters. But the greatest minds on the planet, none of us could really agree or even have any convincing arguments as to what the nature of these entity encounters might actually mean, ontologically speaking. But we did decide that it's probably worthwhile pursuing in an experimental way. So myself and some colleagues formed a group to send out ambassadors to these other realms, but with some kind of empirical basis. And we formulated the interdimensional embassy to do a number of research projects. And we started off with doing some field research where we actually went into people's houses when they were taking DMT. We didn't just turn up unannounced, I have to say. We kind of pre-arranged this. That would have been a little bit freaky for them. And we did a whole bunch of research, gathered some standard psychometric measures and all the rest of it. But we also did a number of kind of active experiments with them, exploring precognition, for one thing, whether or not they could seemingly transcend time and space and bring back information from the future, telepathy, and something that seems to be very common, or relatively more common than you would allow for, perhaps, in ayahuasca or group shared experiences involving DMT, is that people have these experiences of having shared visions. And we wanted to try and get to that empirically as well. Not so easy, but we thought we'd give it a go. We also attempted to explore the nature of the extra-dimensional percepts that people would have, and we kind of devised some experiments using virtual reality to test people's ability to perceive higher dimensional space. Of course, the tasks aren't really up for it because it's impossible to actually represent four-dimensional space, even in virtual reality. The other possibility, of course, being that these might be kind of hyperbolic experiences like non-Euclidean rather than higher dimensional. Anyway, that didn't really work out too well, and we burnt out a couple of higher dimensional mathematicians in the process. So we pretty much abandoned that until such time as we've got a really good measure of being able to perceive higher dimensional space, which we don't currently have, not too unsurprisingly. But we did fully complete a precognition experiment. That's the one with San Pedro. Let's have a look. See if we've got a version of it with DMT. Here we go. Yeah, so I'll run through the protocol we had with San Pedro, actually. Sorry, my slides are a bit in chaos here. I'm dashing around a bit. And the protocol is basically that people would engage in this experimental task of precognition, either, well, actually they did it with repeated measures. So they'd do it once on DMT and once not on DMT, and it'd be randomized in terms of the order, either after taking DMT, once they'd come back down, or before taking DMT. So they do this precognition task twice, once under the influence, once not under the influence. And they would follow this process whereby they would do the visualization, then they'll do the viewing, voting, and then verification. So the visualization was simply that, having been kind of pre-warned, we would say to them, okay, now try and visualize the future target. And we'd do this at a point where they were not actually peaking, but kind of coming down. And we'd established the right kind of subjective intensity in which to do that, as being about 3 or 4 on a scale of 1 to 10. So, you know, if it's a 10, you are at the peak at the beginning of a DMT experience. And if it's actually 10, the anchor was, you can't actually communicate the fact it's a 10. If it is a 10, you can only communicate it's a 9. And so when people had kind of come down the scale of the intensity and they're at a point where it was about 3 or 4, at that point, we said, now try and visualize the future target. So they're in a state in which they have some control over their faculties, but they're also getting lots of mental imagery occurring, if they don't happen to have aphantasia, that is. But that's a whole other discussion, which I won't have time for. So they would kind of have the intention, okay, I want to see the future target. Whatever was going on in their visual mental imagery at that point, they would then kind of remember, log it, and then when they very shortly came out of the experience, they would describe that and it would be written down. And then they would view 4 random or very heterogeneous 1-minute video clips and vote on them and try and determine which one of these 4 video clips was most like your mental imagery, and rate them in a kind of relative manner. So, for instance, that in this example, right, they're looking at these 4 1-minute video clips from different films, and they might go, oh, yeah, well, there was actually quite a lot like that scene from The Matrix, just to kind of a little bit of that kind of overview effect clip, not very much like Rick and Morty, and a smattering of Mary Poppins. And then we get these different ratings for these different video clips. And then the verification stage is that we'd run a random number generator to determine which one of these 4 clips was actually the target, so that the identity of the target was unknown by everybody until the future point in time when the random number generator was run. And so by this method alone, if we repeat the trials enough times, by chance alone, we would only expect people to identify the target 25% of the time. And what we actually found when we ran the experiment was that people performed much better in the DMT condition than the control condition. They got a hit rate of about 40%, which actually concurs with a lot of the parapsychological research extant, and that was a significant finding. And I'm going to give you an example of that. One of our participants said she visualized a 3D hexagon, which she then put in a kind of little very noisy scare quotes, which is a mathematical impossibility in real life that I could see from outside and also from the inside. That's perhaps the least astonishing part. She said inside there were cells, organelles, and DNA strands, and the particular video she chose was one of an animation of a reconstruction of DNA being split and re-spliced back together, which she voted with extreme confidence was the actual target, especially relative to the 3 video clips, which she rated very, very low. And so we were able to determine that she had a high degree of confidence. And when we look at those relative confidence scores, you can see it breaks down like this, in that there's a much higher degree of confidence given to the actual target clips by those people in the DMT condition relative to those not on DMT. And yet the most even more astonishing thing about this is that had people really not had any effect from the DMT in facilitating their precognition. Now, we got a significant finding in that the DMT condition was better than the non-DMT condition significantly, but unfortunately, the non-DMT condition, they scored in the opposite direction. They scored below chance, which kind of throws up some really interesting conundrums, which we are probably best positioned to explain as them somehow unconsciously using their precognition whilst not on DMT to express the demand characteristics of the experiment. That is, they are unconsciously wanting the experiment to work and therefore using precognition to actually demonstrate that, which is a whole other level of extra high weirdness and doesn't necessarily say anything about the psychic inducing powers of DMT, but we need more data. What I also wanted to talk about was that we did some shared visionary experiences. There's our latest book. This is all very random. Experiments, and we are in the process of analysing those. I can't actually say too much about them other than we had some super interesting findings on paper. You know, just subjectively eyeballing the accounts that people gave, they did seem to have an astonishing degree of similarity. So basically, this experimental protocol was a little bit different. Instead of having people doing the task independently or individually, they would do it in pairs, where they wouldn't talk to each other, but people either they would know each other or they wouldn't know each other, and they would turn up and they'd come together and they'd introduce themselves to each other, but we wouldn't allow them to have any conversation. They would do a kind of breathing technique together beforehand, and then they would go into the DMT experience with the intention of sharing their experience. And then as soon as they came out of the DMT experience, the first one to kind of acknowledge that they were had landed back on terra firma would take them off to a different room, different part of the building, and interview them immediately about their experience, and they do a sketch, and then we'd do the same with the other person. And so we have all these transcripts and images from these people who had paired experiences. We're now in the process of developing some software so we can present all of these images and transcripts to independent judges who don't know anything about the content or the nature of the experiment, and they can then judge them to say, okay, when we compare people who had DMT on their own compared to people who had DMT together in a blind test, like with people, independent judges who don't know, can they determine more than chance which ones are actually paired experiences, all other things being equal. So we're in the point of attempting to do that analysis, but we haven't yet finished the programming. That we hope to collect the data on that soon. But just looking at these images and the accounts, even though people said that they had as soon as the DMT kicked in, they completely forgot about their intentions and didn't really ever think about the other person or even find them in their trip, you know. But some of the drawings and the accounts they had lead us to think it's certainly worthwhile doing the next level of complex data collection of independent judging these experiences to see where they may take us. I'm just going to throw all that open now for questions. I hope I can hear you, and we'll leave it there. Sorry for my horrible tech, early morning, not coffee enough fueled breakdowns. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I've just got a question about, I guess, if you've got any ideas about the frequency of certain entities. I myself have experienced the mantids several times, and as you said, they injected things into mostly my forearm and my abdomen. But that was a frequent occurrence on mushrooms. DMT has been other types of entities, and I was wondering if that is such a common occurrence, is that something that you'd think is because they vibrated a similar frequency, or what would make a particular species of entity more common than another?
This is the $1,000,000 question. I think it probably cost us more than that to find out, but thank you for that factoid of yours about insectoids and your question. I don't really have a good answer, but it is interesting that you also had those experiences on mushrooms, or even only had those experiences on mushrooms. Of course, psilocybin, or psilocin at least, isn't a million miles away from DMT in any case, and it is the fungal kingdom's version of DMT. And I think experientially, at high doses, they can be very, very similar. But as to the why some people sometimes get mantids and others don't is a really super interesting question. Maybe we could resolve that in some everyday, ordinary kind of science way, and suddenly discovering perhaps some type of genotype for people who have those kinds of experiences. I don't have much confidence in that. I think perhaps maybe people need to ask the mantids, why do you guys turn up on occasions like this, and for me and not for other people? That might give us at least some insights, though not necessarily valid ones. That's the best I can say, really. I think with this is such a nascent area of research, I don't have any good answers for that question, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. The gene must be the Cronenberg gene. You've entered the interzone. Is it the interzone? I was just quickly like, don't want to get my pop culture references wrong. Thanks very much for that, David. That was very interesting. I'm always interested to hear perspectives on what in the hell is going on, because it's hard to get any kind of coherent answers. Well, not that there's not coherency in there, but as you were kind of alluding to, it's kind of hard to pin it down, I guess. And thanks for grabbing your other laptop for us at that early time in the morning. Do enjoy the day there in the UK. Thanks from me,
so
GA.
much.
It's too much. And thank you, everyone, both in our streaming audience and right here in front of me, for being with us today. We are finished up for the evening, and we'll see you 9:30, I think, tomorrow morning is when it all kicks off again.